Hello, it's Amy. So, a couple of weeks ago, I had the pleasure of reading through this 19th century book on books. This is the Book Fancier by Percy Fitzgerald, published in 1886. And I can well imagine my favorite 20th century author of books on books, A. Edward Newton, poring over this volume sometime in his youth as well. Because it's quite a delightful book, and it's almost a standard formula for everything else that comes after it in terms of books on books. Now, of course, I don't know if this was the first one, the first published book to use this formula. It probably wasn't. But it's the first book I've come across that sort of has this standard subject matter where you talk about, the book, the sort of the cradle books, so the incunables, the early book binding, the Elzevers. Elzevers were a very collectible early bound book. And then you move into talk of libraries and personal collecting. You've got to throw in a little bit about Gutenberg Bibles in there as well. And then talk about book auctions and perhaps some of your own collecting adventures. But this is the earliest book I've read that has that formula. I had a little bit of an accident while reading it on a train. I had been sitting in my seat for several hours when I failed to support the spine of the book, and this happened, sadly. But it's kind of fun because I did get to see the binder's waist here, which is a Cocoa advertisement. So it was unfortunate but interesting. But I read my way through it and enjoyed it. I felt like I'd read a lot of the content before, just because it is sort of that formula almost, or that subject matter that's repeated again and again in almost every book about books in the 20th century, at least one that's trying to be comprehensive. And so we begin with a little section on book collectors and book dealers, the nature of the book collector, the nature of the bibliophile, how they're a little bit crazy. And chapter 2 puzzled me for a moment just because of the terminology that was used. So chapter 2 is about the Mazarin Bible. And I thought, I'd never heard of this Mazarin Bible. And within a few paragraphs, I clued in that we were, in fact, talking about Gutenberg Bibles. It just doesn't seem to have been a term that was commonly used yet. And I think the Mazarin Bible is a particular copy of the Gutenberg Bible. But he goes on to talk about a few other Bibles as well. And this seems to be a point in time when it was, just coming onto the stage of collecting as something that would be intensely desirable. The first Gutenberg Bible had just gone for a big price at auction. And I just said first, but not the first one to be printed. It was sort of the first historical record of a Gutenberg Bible going for an astronomical sum. And I think it actually says in here what it went for. And so the Mazarin Bible and its successor, the Codex, as it says, were fetching near £10,000. I don't know if they're listing the exact price here, but I guess at this one particular auction, people thought, perhaps this book, it was once worth £5 and now it's worth, upwards of £10,000. And he goes on to talk about various books and whatnot. Here's a Bible that went for £3,400, one that sold for £2,690, and so on and so forth. And then the proceeds of a particular 4-day sale here that included this Bible, £26,000. And so that's, of course, interesting to read about Gutenberg Bibles. Now, I'm going to be honest, Gutenberg Bibles don't interest me that much. I'm not too interested in, the history of early printing. Certainly it's interesting and fun to view an incunable, as they're called, or a cradle book, a book from those first couple of decades of printed work. But I can't say I would ever be tempted to purchase one, even if it was within my means, unless it was on a subject that interested me. I'm all about book collecting, but I'm all about book collecting things that I actually want to read. I would never buy a book, no matter how well made, no matter how interesting or beautiful it looked on the outside, if I wasn't also interested in the contents and if I wasn't also interested in reading it. And so we've got the chapters on the cradle books, and then we've got sort of the standard chapter here on the Elzevers, and so that's talking about early printings of books, and I think the Elzevers are out of Amsterdam, if I'm not mistaken, and so on and so forth. So Plantons and the old printers, and to be honest, they all get kind of mixed up in my mind. I've read about, Eldest Manitus and, early printed books and Eldines and Elzevers and all that many times, but it sort of goes whoop over my head because it's just not really my area of interest. Certainly my eyes go over the page and I enjoy it in the moment, but it's not something that I tend to retain, despite the fact that as I was reading this, I thought, oh, this might be, the 7th or 8th time in a book I've come across this subject matter. More about old books and old Bibles and the Latin and Greek classics. Very, enjoyable reading in the moment. Not something where, I'm actively putting together a timeline and memorizing, facts and points of certain books. Because that's just not something I'm ever going to collect at any point. That's not something I'm really that interested in. Now, if they were, say, a museum exhibit full of Eldines and Elzevers and early printed books, certainly I would go. But I wouldn't go out of my way to start collecting them, even if they were within my means, which they are certainly not, because I don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to be spending on books. And then we've got Caxtons, which are, the earliest, one of the earliest, or at least the earliest known English printed books. That's also kind of a standard subject matter. There's a book I'm thinking of by Dana Orcutt, Kingdom of Books, that kind of covers these same topics. And I think Newton, in one of his books on book collecting, covers these same topics. If you go and you read A Gentle Madness, one of the more contemporary books, these topics are going to be covered as well. I think my first interaction with this kind of topic was reading about the Eldines and the Albus Manitus and the printing in Venice, when I read probably the book that started it all, Bound in Venice, which is over on a shelf in the main room of my apartment. So I'm forgetting the author of that one just now. But yeah, so we've got the chapter on Caxtons, mentions of Shakespeare here, all very good quality reading. And then we've got a chapter on the library, which of course talks about how early books, mainly in monasteries, that's where the early books were kept, were chained to the shelf, and they weren't shelved spine out as we do now. They would have been shelved kind of this way, with the exposed papers facing you, because the chains would have been attached here, and or maybe they were here. I know there was something here too, because early books had all sorts of things to keep the pressure on them, and I think perhaps the chain probably somewhere back here, but there would have been a clasp here too to help keep it shut. And so we've got that on libraries. But then we come to my favorite chapter in this book, the chapter on the auction room, and I get what might be the original account, or one of the earliest accounts Certainly closer to the original source material account than I got, reading book collectors of the 1920s. But it is an account of a auction in air quotes, an auction, a little trick played on book collectors. And so he says here on page 224, as we survey this interesting scene, one of the most fantastic bibliographical tricks, one connected with the auction room played in the year 1840, recurs to us when the sale of Viscount J.N.A. de Fortes's rare and valuable collection was announced all over Europe. The sale, says a pleasant bibliograph essayist writing in the daily paper, was advertised to take place at the office of a notary residing in Binch, an insignificant town in Belgium. The catalogue covered only 14 largely printed pages and contained a list of the 52 books forming the Count's collection, each of which was unique. It was added that Monsieur de Fortes would keep no volume if he found it mentioned in any bibliography. The catalogues were sent to the great book collectors of France, England, and the United States, and each recipient supposed himself to be specially favored and kept the secret to himself. 2 days before the sale, Brunet, Nodier, Techner, and Renard met accidentally in the diligence which ran from Paris to Brussels. And I'm assuming all those names are probably, notable book collectors that perhaps would have been known to the audience of this book here if they were collectors themselves or reading other works at the time about collectors. And each hoped his neighbour had heard nothing of the wonderful auction which was about to take place. It was related that Monsieur Caston of Liz, or Lyles, perhaps? Lisle, took great interest in a work said to have been published by Casman of Tournai on the subject of the Belgian Revolution of 1830, the entire edition of which had been suppressed, although Monsieur de Fortes had been so fortunate as to gain possession of a single copy. Being a little incredulous as to a library of which he had never heard, Monsieur Caston stopped at Tournai and called on the publisher to inquire if such a work had ever been issued by his firm. Monsieur Casman had himself forgotten all about the edition in question, but his foreman recollected it, and its author, Monsieur Lecoq, perfectly, a fact which at once silenced the inquirer's suspicions. The Baron de Riefenberg, director of the Royal Library at Brussels, asked for a special appropriation to buy some of the Count de Fortes's treasures, which was immediately granted. One ardent bookseller made the journey from Amsterdam in order to see a single volume, the Corpus Juris Civilis, printed by the Elzevers on vellum. The Princess de Lin, anxious to preserve the reputation of her grandfather, wrote to a commissioner to buy number 48 for her at any price. The Roxburgh Club was represented at the sale, and singularly enough, there were books in the catalogue which appeared to the taste of every distinguished collector. On the day before the sale, the good people of Binch were astonished at the number of mysterious strangers who had suddenly appeared in their midst without any ostensible cause. At last, the eventful morning arrived, and in the newspaper circulated at Binch there appeared a curt notice that the library of the Count de Fortes would not be sold, as the municipal council had resolved to keep it in honour of its collector, their distinguished fellow townsman. It now came out that the Count de Fortes was a myth. His chateau and his library were both apocryphal. As we walked through the auction room, ghostly figures seemed to rise before us, the old heroes of many an exciting contest. It would almost seem that for them the spirit of competition was the charm. The shades of Lord Spencer, Herbert, Bernal, and others must haunt these places. And it goes on to talk more about English collectors, but I think that's still a mystery to this day, who decided to play that practical joke, although it seems quite an expensive practical joke to basically lure collectors from all over the world on an expensive cross-continental, in some cases cross-ocean journey to a sale that doesn't exist. And certainly it must have been, a fellow book collector, someone who knew the taste of these collectors intimately. But I just always think that's a fun little story to read about. But going on from the auction room, there's a chapter here on Shakespeare folios and quartos. And that is more or less how he ends off this little book. But as I said, one of the earliest books on books that I've read. There are, of course, a few, well-known early ones, but this is the earliest book memoir that I think I've read. I've read a few from the 1890s, certainly many from the first 2 to 3 decades of the 20th century, and a few more recent ones. But this one was just a great little book to read, even if I had, experienced the subject matter myself several times before. It's still always, enjoyable, relaxing to read through books on books, especially when it's as well written as this one. I guess the only criticism there when I say well written, it's an engaging text, but it is the 1860s, and some works from the end of the 19th century seem to have what I would call punctuation issues where the sentences run on and you have all these commas in places where today we would not be placing commas, just for the clarity of it. I seem to do okay here, but if I were to read aloud too much of this one, I think I would stumble a lot just because of the way the sentences are structured. But when you're just reading silently to yourself, not so much of an issue. It's just if you're going to read this one aloud, you might stumble a little bit. But I'll leave it there for today. So this is The Book Fancier by Percy Fitzgerald, one that I immensely enjoyed.